By the late 19th century, winemaking in Alto Adige was improving. And then, almost overnight, everything began to collapse. Over the centuries, Alto Adige didn't exist in isolation. It became part of something much larger, a region shaped not just by local traditions, but by empire. For hundreds of years, Alto Adige was under the control of the Habsburgs. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Count of Tirolo had accumulated enough power to dominate the region, and Alto Adige found itself under Habsburg rule, a situation that would persist, with some interruptions, for roughly 700 years. The Habsburgs were, among other things, excellent wine consumers. On the list of wineries supplying the Habsburg emperors, Tirolo was always present. The emperor and his court preferred Friuli white wines alongside Tirolese reds. The King of Prussia also had Tirolese wine in his cellar. In the 18th century, red wine from Alto Adige was described as amabile, pleasantly sweet, and was highly sought after. Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV went so far as to personally praise Lagrein, declaring it the best wine from the area. When a Holy Roman Emperor reviews your wine, that is a marketing opportunity that money can't buy. The Habsburg connection shaped the wine culture of Alto Adige in one particularly lasting way. It locked in the German-speaking identity of the region. Even as the rest of Italy developed its wine culture in a distinctly Latin direction, Alto Adige remained Tyrolean in character, in language, and in its grape varieties. It also meant that the primary export market for Alto Adige wine was, for centuries, the German-speaking world: Austria, Bavaria, Hungary. This market orientation would prove both a strength and a vulnerability, as we'll see. Under the Habsburgs, Alto Adige became part of a much larger political and economic system. But it was until the 19th century that things really began to change, because that was when winemaking became more structured, more connected, and increasingly influenced by science. The 19th century was a period of dramatic transformation for Alto Adige viticulture, driven by three forces: new grape varieties, new infrastructure, and new institutions. The central figure in the story of new varieties is Archduke Johann of Austria. In the early 1800s, this remarkable Habsburg aristocrat took a passionate interest in agriculture and introduced a wave of new varieties to the region: Riesling, Pinot Bianco, Pinot Nero, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, through the Imperial Royal Agricultural Society of Tirolo and Vorarlberg. The extraordinarily broad assortment of grapes grown in Alto Adige today, that remarkable palette of 20 or more varieties, traces its origins directly to that period 160 years ago. Every time you drink a Pinot Bianco or a Riesling from Alto Adige, you are, in a small way, drinking the legacy of an archduke who thought farming was interesting. In 1874, the first agrarian school and experimental enology department was created in San Michele all'Adige. This institution brought scientific methodology to what had previously been entirely traditional practice. The following year, Edmund Mach became director of the Istituto Agrario and made a decision that would define the region. He determined that the quality of local grapes was insufficient for the quality of wine he wanted to produce, and initiated the systematic import of Austro-Hungarian and German varieties, particularly for difficult elevated terroir. At the time, there were more than 500 varieties being cultivated across Trentino and Alto Adige, a combination of American hybrids, Euro-American crosses, and traditional European varieties. The goal was to identify which grapes performed best in which specific zones, and to begin the long process of matching variety to terroir with scientific precision. Now, talking about the railways, they changed everything. The Brennero line opened in 1867, the Valpusteria line in 1871. Suddenly, wine that had previously been transported in barrels through treacherous mountain passes over the Brenner Pass and the Resia Pass, in winter, by ox or horse cart, in conditions that we might compare to the most extreme weather driving imaginable, now could be moved efficiently and in volume. Transport before the railways was genuinely brutal. In springtime, it was the period for moving the previous year's wine by horse and carriage, and more often with bulls and cattle. The roads taken to transport wine across the Alps were treacherous enough that they were considered an occupational hazard. The opening of the railways didn't just speed up commerce, it transformed the entire economic geography of the region. And by 1880, there were already 94 wine and liquor merchants in Alto Adige. By 1900, there were 21 notable wine merchants in Bolzano alone. The professional wine trade was becoming a real industry. By the late 19th century, wine in Alto Adige was becoming more organized and more advanced. But just as things were starting to improve, a crisis arrived that would change everything. Now, no history of European wine can avoid phylloxera, the microscopic root louse that, in the latter half of the 19th century, destroyed the vast majority of Europe's vineyards, and Alto Adige was no exception. But the story of phylloxera in this region is actually more complicated, and in some ways more interesting, than the simple narrative of devastation. The crisis came in waves, and each wave had unexpected consequences. In the late 1800s, Austrian viticulture was being decimated by phylloxera. This created an enormous increase in demand for Trentino and Alto Adige wine. From 1882 to 1890, the vineyard surface in Trentino alone expanded from 2,100 hectares to 6,255 hectares. Demand was so high and prices so favorable that producers rushed to plant more vines. But then came the economic backlash. Duties on Italian wine entering the Austro-Hungarian Empire were reduced so dramatically that 94% of wine purchased by Austria was coming from small Italian provinces. This flooded the market. The prices of grapes produced in Trentino collapsed so severely that it didn't even cover basic production costs for farmers. And then, in one of history's more ironic twists, phylloxera came to the rescue. When phylloxera struck Hungary, destroying its vineyards, demand for white wine from Alto Adige surged dramatically, rescuing the local wine economy. Phylloxera was finally identified in Bolzano in 1901 and in San Michele in 1907. The impact on yield was catastrophic. From 1891 to 1900, the average yield had been 25 quintali per hectare. From 1915 to 1917, it had collapsed to just 7 quintali per hectare. The response of the authorities is worth noting, though, because it was actually remarkably progressive for its time. If a winemaker lost more than 1/4 of their harvest due to phylloxera, they could have 100% of their property tax cancelled. That same tax could be suspended for 10 years if the winemaker needed to replant their vineyard. The government could even offer loans to help vintners avoid bankruptcy. This is early 20th century agricultural policy designed specifically to prevent the collapse of the wine industry during a pest crisis. And it worked, at least partially. And while we are on the topic of agricultural science, Trentino Alto Adige holds a remarkable distinction. It is the region where the first remedy for vine mildew was discovered: sulfur. By 1479, there is documentary evidence of using sulfur to smoke empty vats before refilling them, and of using dry yeast when fermenting damaged grapes. Thanks to sulfur, wine maintains the variety's typical aroma even after the first racking. To put that in context, France was still not using sulfur in 1600, so this region was more than a century ahead of one of the most famous wine cultures in the world in adopting this fundamental technique. Now, the phylloxera epidemic devastated vineyards across Europe, and Alto Adige was no exception. After phylloxera, rebuilding wasn't enough. Winemakers had to start thinking differently. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Formal wine tasting, the act of gathering a group of people specifically to evaluate wine in a structured and deliberate way, was largely an invention of the 19th century. The first wine tasting of an Alto Adige wine on record was of a Riesling in 1852. Then, on February 12, 1874, the first public wine tasting event in Alto Adige was held in a train station restaurant in Bolzano. 18 producers accepted the invitation. Over 3 days, 98 wines were tasted. That same year, 1864, a major tasting was held in Vienna, with over 1,340 wines represented. The Pinot Nero of Alto Adige was noted as exceptional, described as capable of standing toe-to-toe with the best French Pinot. However, its scores at the event didn't reflect this quality, because the judges of the time gave higher scores to more concentrated, dense, and sweet wines. The lighter, more elegant style of Alto Adige Pinot was simply ahead of the prevailing taste. Augusto von Bobo, a notable commentator at the time, actually criticized this scoring approach, arguing it was a mistake, that dessert and heavily extracted wines were losing value precisely because artificial imitations were becoming common. He was essentially making the argument for terroir-driven elegance 160 years before it became mainstream discourse. The first wine exhibition in Bolzano was held in 1896. Professional commerce of wine only really developed in the 19th century, though 300 years earlier, there had been informal commerce setting the precedent. Wine tasting, as we know it, the ritual, the vocabulary, the culture of critical evaluation, is surprisingly young. As winemaking became more refined and the way people drank and judged wine evolved, producers also began to experiment. And in a region like Alto Adige with its cool climate and high altitude, this new way of thinking led somewhere unexpected. You might not immediately associate Alto Adige with sparkling wine, but the region has a longer history with bubbles than most people realize. In 1899, a Viennese entrepreneur founded the Cantina Champagne dell'Alto Adige in Appiano, specifically to produce a local sparkling wine for the aristocratic market. The venture produced a wine for the 15th Mercato Vini di Bolzano in 1911, a Riesling-based sparkler marketed under the name Riesling Gold. Then, World War I happened, and sparkling wine production essentially came to a standstill for decades. The Renaissance came in the 1960s, driven by one man, Sebastian Stocker, the Mastro Cantiniere, or head winemaker, of the Cantina Sociale di Terlano. In 1960, he produced the first modern, brut sparkling wine from Alto Adige, and his influence on the region went beyond bubbles. In 1956, Stocker had also produced a Sauvignon Blanc that he presented at the Mostra dei Vini di Bolzano in 1957. That wine is considered the most impactful single Sauvignon for the future of the variety in all of Italy. The first official sparkling wine winery in Alto Adige was founded by Louise Oxenreiter in Salorno in 1977. The sparkling wine tradition in this region, though often overlooked, is real, and it is worth exploring. By the end of the 19th century, Alto Adige had already gone through profound change. It had been shaped by empire, refined by science, and tested by crisis. And each time, it adapted. But the challenges of the past were nothing compared to what was coming next. Because in the 20th century, the forces shaping this region would no longer be gradual. They would be sudden, political, and deeply personal.